Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 25, and today I'm here with Dr. Ross Greene talking about collaboration. Dr. Greene is the originator of the innovative, evidence-based approach called collaborative and proactive solutions, as described in his influential book, The Explosive Child. He was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School for over 20 years, has worked with several thousand behaviorally challenging kids and their families, and is now founding director of the nonprofit Lives in the Balance. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. If you are loving the Sage Family Podcast, then become a part of it through Patreon, where you can support these important conversations, help make this show great, and get rewards doing it. And by the way, the irony is not lost on me that in several episodes of this podcast, including this one, I speak out against rewards while simultaneously offering rewards to Patreon supporters. I don't want you to support the show because if you do, you earn a signed copy of the Sage Homeschooling book. If you choose to support the show, I want it to be because you believe in it. You believe in the benefit of listening to these conversations, and you want to be a part of supporting that work. You understand that immense time and work goes into creating this show, and you want to be a part of that effort to make the lives of families better. And if you join me in making this show all it can be, I want to extend a token of my gratitude. And Patreon's system to support this is, quote, rewards. So I'm going to keep giving away public thank yous to patrons, but it's done with a wink because you know that I know that you're doing it because it's the right thing to do and not because of any proverbial carrots. Our adventure of the week this episode is Tinkertopia, minimalist organizer's nightmare or maker's dream. It was actually a really neat place owned by husband and wife artists who recycle discarded loose parts into maker materials and run a tinkerer workshop. Love us some mentorship from unique and passionate people in interesting places. My kids moved around the space with their friends, creating masterpieces out of a variety of materials and tools. Even just getting to Tinkertopia was part of the educational fun, as the kids used the posted maps and schedules for us to take the train. If you want to see photos and videos of this adventure, then head on over to Sage Parenting on Instagram and follow along. Today, Dr. Ross Greene is joining me to share a conversation on collaboration. Many years ago, when I was finding my way with my high-needs firstborn child, I found an article by him that gave an overview of his approach, along with research outcomes supporting its efficacy. After many years working with and studying families, along with getting to know my own child, I knew that connection and collaboration were the way, but this article presented a specific, easy-to-follow, universal framework. So I read his book, The Explosive Child, and it exceeded my expectations, aligning with everything I knew to be true and adding a tremendous tool that I still use today with my 3 kids, my husband, and all the relationships in life, really. And I've been referencing and recommending his work ever since. So tell us your story, Ross. Who are you? What are you passionate about? And what is your relationship with this topic of collaboration?
Who am I? I'm the short little guy who originated a model called collaborative and proactive solutions that I first published in written form in The Explosive Child, and it's been a very fun ride ever since then, which has been about 20 years.
Wow.
I'm a child psychologist. Over those 20 years, we have done a lot of research on the model, which is why it's now what's known as evidence-based. We've been implementing it with literally hundreds of thousands of families, and in lots and lots of schools and inpatient psychiatry units and residential facilities and juvenile detention facilities. And boy, we've been seeing some really wonderful things happen in all of those settings when people use the model and shift from being punitive and reactive to being collaborative and proactive.
Yes. And well, so let's start with the why. I recently shared a conversation with Alfie Kohn in episode 21 of this podcast, and we really got into the nitty gritty of why the mainstream reward and punishment model, including reward charts and consequences, are ineffective, and that kids don't, quote, misbehave from a lack of motivation. Kids do well if they can. Your work extends nicely from his, and I want to build on that. You assert that challenging episodes occur whenever a kid doesn't have the skills to deal well with the demands that are being placed on them. Share with us what you mean by lacking skills. Why do children misbehave?
Well, earlier, just before you got to lagging skills, you talked about rewards and punishments don't work. And the reality is that they do work at modifying behavior. So if all we're interested in doing is modifying behavior, then rewards and punishments do work. The published research tells us it's so, and there's quite a bit of it. But what I always say to people, and I was just saying it to some people I had in my office who were visiting from Denmark, all we're focused on is not behavior. Behavior is just the signal, just the fever, just the way the kid is communicating. I'm stuck. There are expectations I'm having difficulty meeting. So if all we're busy doing is modifying the behavior, all we're busy doing is modifying the signal. The good news is that when you're solving problems collaboratively and proactively, you are improving behavior every bit as much as you would be if you were modifying behavior. But you are doing some other things as well. When you're solving problems collaboratively and proactively, you are also solving the problems that are causing those behaviors. And you are also teaching kids the skills that they are lacking. And that's what the research tells us about kids who are behaviorally challenging. They are lacking skills. They are not lacking motivation. And those lagging skills are making it difficult for them to meet certain expectations that in the CPS model we call unsolved problems. In this model, you are focused on solving those problems, and when you do it collaboratively and proactively, the research tells us not only are you solving the problems, not only are you reducing the challenging behaviors that occur in response to those unsolved problems, you are also teaching the kid the skills he or she is lacking. I like to call that a 3-for-1 sale.
Yeah, and I guess by like punishments and rewards, by that model not working, the research shows that it can garner that short-term compliance, right? But what you're talking about is that behavior is kind of the symptom, and the problem is that they're lacking these skills. And so if you're not addressing that, those symptoms are going to keep showing up in a myriad of ways over the long period of time.
I think that the best way I can put it is to go back to the old expression, you're missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, yes. Okay, so if I'm a struggling parent, the first thing I'm going to do in your approach is look at your list of lagging skills to check which ones apply, and then list out unsolved problems associated with each one, starting with the word difficulty. In addition to being a powerful conceptual shift, this acts as a sort of roadmap. What are some examples of lagging skills and unsolved problems?
Well, first of all, if people want to see what you're talking about, it's an instrument that I developed called the Assessment of Lagging Skills and Unsolved Problems. They can find it on the Lives in a Balance website. It, like all the other resources on the website, is free.
And we are going to link to that for sure.
Beautiful. Down the left-hand side is a list of lagging skills. Down the right-hand side is where people are going to be writing in unsolved problems. The first lagging skill is difficulty handling transitions, shifting from one mindset or task to another. So if parents or teachers or other caregivers have the general sense that a kid is lacking that skill, they check it off. Don't have to be super precise about which lagging skills we check off. If we have the general feeling that the kid is lacking those skills, check it off. But then instead of moving down to the next lagging skill, we are instead moving over and asking the following question. Can you give me some expectations the kid is having difficulty meeting that you think of when you think of him having difficulty handling transitions, shifting from one mindset or task to another? What are we talking about now? Unsolved problems. So some examples of some expectations a kid is having difficulty meeting that might spring to mind when we are contemplating that lagging skill would be things like difficulty turning off the TV to come in for dinner, difficulty ending the computer game to get ready for bed at night, difficulty completing morning routine in time for school in the morning. Those are all expectations. They're all springing to mind when we're thinking of the lagging skill, difficulty handling transitions, shifting from one mindset or task to another.
Got it. The empathy step. So next you schedule what I call a collaboration session, which is like a proactive meeting outside of any conflicts or stresses. In my bucket system class, I explain how we use collaboration to design our homeschooling each season around what my kids want to learn, practice, and experience, and how we can best meet their needs and support their strengths and challenges, and just to maintain our home around things like chores. But that meeting, that needs and supporting challenges piece during that meeting, that's your 3-step process, which includes the empathy step, the define the problem step, and the invitation step. So can you explain what happens in step 1, the empathy step?
In the empathy step, we are gathering information from the kid to find out what's making it hard for him to meet that particular expectation that we're talking with him about right now. What are his concerns? What's his perspective? What's his point of view? But especially what's making it hard for him to meet that expectation.
Yeah, I've noticed that, right? Like, I've noticed that. What's up? It's like a lot of parents will try to impose a solution from on high based on their perspective. And when you're missing step 1, you're missing the informed part. You can't have you can't have a solution that works if it's not informed with what's actually going on for the kid, right?
You're not going to be able to solve the problem if you don't find out what the kid's concerns are, because a solution has to be realistic, but especially also mutually satisfactory. Mutually satisfactory means the solution addresses the concerns of both parties. If you're not going to be able to come up with a mutually satisfactory solution unless you know from the kid what his concern or perspective is on this unsolved problem. And what's interesting is a lot of adults think that the best source of information for what's making it hard for a kid to meet a particular expectation is themselves. Without question, the best source of information on what's making it hard for a kid to meet a particular expectation is the kid. The step is where you're gathering that information from the kid.
Yes. There have been so many times when I've been frustrated with some expectation that's not being met on a recurring basis. And when I sit down with an open mind and ask my kid these open-ended questions, I'm continually surprised by the insight that they provide. Part of this too is prioritizing. Like, I know you talked about, especially if you've really been mired in conflict, you might have a list of like 100 things that you want to just unpack all at once. But during this empathy step, when you're really just bringing a few, like your top priorities to the table, right?
That's correct. And, I've never seen somebody have 100. As I was just telling some folks at the local hospital, some psychiatry residents, the record at the moment, as far as I can tell, is held by a kid in Norway who has 79. So it's probably not going to go well beyond that. But, we're always looking for somebody to break the record. But you're not going to be able to work on 79 different unsolved problems at once. And most kids aren't going to have that many. Most kids who've been challenging for a long time are going to have, 25, 30, 35 unsolved problems. But you can't work on them all at once. So then you've got to prioritize. And you're going to pick 2 or 3 that you're going to start working on at first. And you're never going to be working on more than two or three unsolved problems at a time. Otherwise, both the caregivers and the kid are going to get overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the task at hand.
Exactly. And then one last thing too with the empathy step that I've found really valuable is that sometimes in these collaboration sessions, my children will bring up things that I've been struggling with. And that I've found has really gone a long way in the empathy building and in the teamwork. I'll bring up something that I'm noticing and ask them what's going on with it, and we'll move through this process. And then the kids will often say, like, I've been noticing that like you've been really struggling in this context in this way, like what's up with that? And so we'll discuss it. So I've found that oftentimes when I'm in the empathy step, I also have to be willing to, get vulnerable and be a team member with my kid and be open to the feedback that they provide me as well.
Well, this is an interesting thing about solving problems collaboratively. This is a partnership.
Yeah.
I think all of parenting is a partnership. And you know what? Partners give each other feedback. Partners help each other out. If you are modeling for a kid solving problems together and coming up with mutually satisfactory solutions, and if you expect the kid to be willing to listen to your concerns, then it's got to be reciprocal. And we're going to expect that we're going to have to listen to the kid's concerns. And if we expect the kid to listen to feedback about ourselves, about the kid, then we're going to have to listen to feedback about ourselves. Doesn't mean we're not authority figures anymore. Doesn't mean we're on exactly equal footing. Parents are still the ones who have the expectations. Parents are still the ones with the wisdom and experience and values, all of which are being transmitted through our expectations. So it's not a perfectly level playing field. But when it comes to solving problems and communicating and relationships, we are willing to listen to what the kid has to say about us.
Okay, so next comes the define the problem step, step 2. What does that look like?
And we now call that the define adult concerns step, just so that it's a little less confusing. Okay. And that's where the adult is entering his or her concerns into consideration on the same unsolved problem. As I always say, we adults have very important concerns as well. The only problem is we frequently don't have the slightest idea what they are because we've already moved on to our solutions, which we are usually busy imposing. This can take some work for some parents. And to make this easier and other caregivers, adult concerns fall into one or both of two categories: how the unsolved problem is affecting the kid, how the unsolved problem is affecting other people. And actually, that little set of guidance has made that usually the easiest and the fastest of the 3 steps.
Yeah.
But if we don't get the adults' concerns on the table, then in the same way that if we don't get the kids' concerns on the table, we're not going to know what concerns we're trying to address with the solution that we're going to come up with in the 3rd step.
Right. The empathy step is like gathering the kids' perspective on how it affects them, and then the define the problem step, or the new verbiage that you have for that step, is where you kind of say my concern is, right? Like how you see the problem affecting them or how it's affecting other people.
That's correct.
Okay, so then you move into the invitation step. What happens there?
Since we had an example for the empathy step, let's do one for the concern step 2.
Yes, please.
Let's say that the unsolved problem was difficulty turning off the computer to come in for dinner, or turning off the TV to come in for dinner. Let's say the kid's concern is that dinner often happens right in the middle of a show and the kid wants to see the ending of the show. And of course, that's simple, but the empathy step could go on for 8, 10, 12 minutes.
Right.
While we're gathering all of the information we need about the kid's various concerns.
And drilling down.
Yep, and drilling for information. And then the adult's concern could be that, we don't want dinner to get cold because then all of us are waiting for you and the dinner's getting cold. But dinner is where we get together as a family and hear about each other's day and just connect with each other. And we would really like you to be a part of that because we would miss you and we think you would miss us if that didn't happen. Now we've got two sets of concerns on the table.
Yes. Okay, so then step 3, the invitation step. So what happens there?
And by the way, notice what we're not talking about here is the aftermath of the unsolved problem, right? So here's the aftermath. Because that problem isn't solved yet, and then we'll get to the invitation, because that problem still isn't solved. And by the way, I should also point out that problem's highly predictable because we've been fighting the same thing for the last 3 years. So we can solve it proactively rather than in the heat of the moment. But what most parents and other caregivers focus on is what happens in the midst of that unsolved problem popping up yet again. Billy, it's time to come in for dinner. I'm in the middle of my show. Billy, get your butt in here now. I'm not coming in until my show is done, and now here we are off to the races. That's all the aftermath. All of that is the aftermath. What is setting that in motion in the first place is difficulty turning off the TV to come in for dinner. By the way, once that problem is solved, and once again, since it's predictable, it can be solved proactively, then we're not going to have the aftermath over that unsolved problem anymore. And we can turn our attention to another unsolved problem instead of focusing on its aftermath. We don't want to be focused on aftermath. It's what happens once you're focused on the aftermath, once you're focused on the behavior, you are way late to the show.
Right.
The invitation is where kid and caregiver are collaborating on a solution. But as I mentioned earlier, a solution that must meet 2 criteria. Got to be realistic. Both parties got to be able to do what they're agreeing to do. Got to be mutually satisfactory, meaning it truly addresses the concerns of both parties. So now let's return to the concerns of both parties. The kid doesn't want to miss the ending of his show. The parents don't want dinner to get cold and really want the kid to be a part of the family dinner. We're then looking at the kid and say, I wonder if there's a way for us to make sure you don't miss the end of your show and also make sure that the dinner doesn't get cold and make sure that we're all together for dinner as a family. You're then giving the kid the first crack at the solution. Do you have any ideas? Not because it's his job to solve the problem. It's y'all's job to solve the problem. If the kid doesn't have any ideas, we hope you do. But it's very good strategy because it lets the kid know beyond a shadow of a doubt you're actually interested in his ideas.
Agreed.
What might a potential solution to that be? And now it's time to get creative because, when all you're focused on is the screaming and the, whatever's going on in the aftermath, there's not a whole lot of room for creativity. But now there's a whole lot of room for creativity. There's a DVR. There's timing dinner for a certain time. There's having the kid not start a show that he won't be able to finish and maybe taping it instead. Now we can start being creative. If all we're focused on is behavior, we're not being creative, we're being robotic.
Yes, and it blows me away the solutions that the kids come up with that never even occurred to me that work beautifully. Sometimes, especially with younger kids, you have to kind of rein in that realistic component a little bit. But especially the more they do it and the older they get, they come up with brilliant solutions that I never would have thought of that address the problem in a mutually satisfactory way.
Yep, kids can surprise you. I'm always telling people don't sell those 3-year-olds short. Kids are amazing with the solutions they come up with. And by the way, just like the rest of us, sometimes they need some coaching on what's realistic. Sometimes they need some coaching on what's going to be mutually satisfactory. Generally speaking, though, they are so pleased that they are now being involved in solving the problems that affect their lives. They're okay with some coaching on what's going to be realistic and mutually satisfactory.
Right. Because they feel like it's a team effort. You're working collaboratively. And when you kids learn to be empathetic and respectful by being treated empathetically and respectful. And when we're talking about collaboration, the more I, with an open mind, invite my children in and I'm open to their collaboration, the more they are for my end of it as well. So if I'm honestly taking in the insight that they have to share and the solutions that they have, then they extend that to me the other way as well.
Right. A lot of times these days people are saying, how do you teach empathy? The best way to teach empathy is by being empathic and by modeling it.
Exactly. So revision. For me, I think of revision as closing the loop. Like I said, we have these collaboration sessions once a season. So we come back together every 3 months and move through the 3 steps again. We discuss how the problem has changed, what we've learned, what's helping, what isn't, why or why not, and what new solution ideas or adjustments we have. And then we can also move something else up from that list of unsolved problems. Of course, if the problem is significantly negatively affecting the child or the family, we come back together much sooner, like after a couple weeks. I find that when my children can trust that we will revisit and adjust, they are braver in suggesting and trying potential solutions. Like, let's just try it and see what happens. Worst case scenario, we get to know you and the problem a little better. Why do you see this last recurring step as important for long-term success with this approach?
If a problem is solved, it's usually pretty obvious. But if the original solution doesn't quite get the job done, then yes, we've got to go back to plan B to figure out, did we miss some concerns? Was there something about the solution that wasn't as realistic and mutually satisfactory as we thought it was? I would call that problem solving in the real world. That's how problems get solved in the real world. In the real world, the first solution often doesn't solve the problem durably.
Well, the first solution often shows us that what we thought was the problem was actually not the problem. I find that a lot, that moving through this process and we try a solution, often the first one is the one that they come up with, and we'll apply the solution and we'll realize, oh, so that did address that problem, but now we realize that what's actually hanging us up is this problem that's a little bit different that was affected by that. It just you just sort of get deeper and deeper until you actually nail on what the real problem is.
That can certainly happen. And then you need the concerns related to what you're now talking about. So yes, once again, problem solving is incremental, and often the first solution isn't going to solve the problem durably. Sometimes there are concerns you didn't hear about, and you got to go back to address them if the first solution didn't address them.
Yeah, and if I've found, and maybe it's just my kid, but that or kids, that if they feel like the first solution that we agree on is set in stone and it's forever, then they are far less brave in their willingness to try out solutions. So just knowing that we can come back together at a future time and see what we've learned and make adjustments makes them far more willing to try things that they might otherwise not be willing to try.
I totally agree with that, but I also think that the whole process makes kids braver about participating in the problem-solving process, because there's really no such thing as a bad solution.
Right.
There's only solutions that we haven't thought through well enough in terms of whether they're realistic and mutually satisfactory. Lots of bravery here. And if you ask me, what kind of skills do we want a kid to have to do well in the real world? And it's fascinating to me that a lot of people hear about this model and they say, well, that's not the real world.
It's exactly the real world.
I find it fascinating that people would say that, but this is the real world. Being able to work out problems with people is the real world, and being able to do it collaboratively. I don't know if you're familiar with the author Tony Wagner, but he's written some very influential books about the skills kids are going to need in the world of the future, and 2 of the top 5 are collaboration and problem solving, and none of the top 5 are blind adherence to authority.
I could not agree more. And like I said in the beginning, these skills and this process that I got from your book are skills that I use across all realms of life. It's really not just a parenting skill. And so in addition to helping with on the parenting side and to help with the parenting, part of the motivation in doing this work is to impart my children with these skills that they carry into their friendships and they carry into relationships that they're going to have into adulthood as well.
And into the workplace.
Yes.
Employers are increasingly looking for people who know how to collaborate and solve problems. That's in high demand these days. Having people blindly adhere to something that isn't working very well actually is not a very good business model either.
Right. I mean, can you imagine if a supervisor at a Fortune 500 company told one of their valued employees, "You're doing it wrong, do it better." The product would never get better. The employee has to find out, what is it about this that's not working for you? Or what's your actual goal with this that we're missing? And then the boss would come to the employee or would tell the employee, what the problem is from their perspective. And then they would have to work collaboratively on solutions for how to get over that hump.
Right. Or we're not interested in a computer that processes information any faster. Our computers have been selling fine for a long time. We'll just stay slow.
Okay, let's talk about efficacy. So you have research that just keeps getting confirmed, supporting the efficacy of this approach with even the most difficult of children in the most challenging of settings. What are some tough cases that have been cracked with your approach, and why do you think it's so universally effective across confounding variables?
Well, we've done this in child and adult prisons and have helped prisons stop using solitary confinement, by and large, stop laying hands on kids as much as they were. We've reduced recidivism dramatically, the rate of kids leaving and coming back. We've done this in adult psychiatric facilities. I don't have data on that yet, but proof that you can even solve problems collaboratively with adults who are not having an easy time thinking clearly. We've done this in many difficult schools and families. I don't really, not sure how to rank degree of difficulty when it comes to implementing the model. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people rank degree of difficulty based on the kid's behavior, and I don't. I don't really see much difference between a kid who's communicating that he or she is having difficulty meeting expectations by crying and one who's doing it by hitting or spitting or swearing or screaming or throwing or destroying. For me, and for the field of developmental psychopathology, those are all on a level playing field. The important thing is what problems are causing that behavior, right, not what behavior. And that's also why we're not very diagnostic in this model, because diagnoses, psychiatric disorders, are just long lists of, in kids anyways, behaviors.
Right.
So I don't really rank degree of difficulty. I take them one unsolved problem at a time, one kid at a time. Yes, there are some settings that are tougher than others just because of the sheer number of behaviorally challenging kids who they've packed into the place. Mm-hmm. But I can't say that I rank doing this in a prison at a higher degree of difficulty than doing it in a school. Schools have all kinds of factors that make it hard for classroom teachers to solve problems with their kids. So schools can be just as tough as any place else. And there are often family dynamics that make it very difficult for a parent and a kid to get together to solve a problem collaboratively. So I'm taking them one problem, one family, one situation at a time. I'm not worrying too much about degree of difficulty.
I love that so much. And why do you think it's so universally effective across all of those confounding variables?
Because often everywhere people have been primarily focused on behavior and modifying it rather than on solving the problems that are causing that behavior. Often caregivers in universally similar settings have been viewing challenging behavior through the prism of lagging motivation rather than the prism of lagging skills. Universally across the board, people have been trying to deal with challenging behavior emergently rather than proactively. And they've been saying that those unsolved problems, which they often didn't know anything about in the first place, were unpredictable when in fact they are highly predictable. So I can't imagine why those ingredients wouldn't be effective in any particular setting.
Right.
It's always the same thing that's making it difficult for us to help these kids.
Right. Okay, so I want to do a little Q&A. I posted in my Sage Parenting Tribe on Facebook that we were going to chat about collaboration today and asked if anyone had any questions about it. Paula wants to know how to use this collaboration process with siblings.
Well, when siblings, we're still assuming that both parties have legitimate concerns. We still need to identify what they are. An unsolved problem that I heard about this morning was difficulty cleaning room together with brother. All right, the aftermath of that is huge fights, but the unsolved problem is difficulty cleaning room with brother. That's not a problem that is going to get solved just with parents and one kid. It's going to have to be a solution that they're both good with. There's another one that took place in my office recently. Difficulty sharing toys during playtime. And for those of you who are wondering, can you do this with a younger kid? This was done with a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, 2 siblings. And I heard from the 3-year-old that there were just some toys she didn't want her sibling playing with.
Which is totally developmentally appropriate at that age and stage.
I'm an old guy, and there's still some toys I don't want people playing with. So, I'm not sure whether it developmentally goes away. But the solution ended up being that any toys they didn't want the other one to play with, they have a shared play space. Any toy, the 6-year-old came up with this solution, which I was really impressed and told him so. Any toys they didn't want their sibling to be playing with would be in their room. Anything in their room, off limits to the other sibling. And then the addition to this, because I foresaw that in a 3 and 6-year-old that people might change their mind precipitously about what they wanted their sibling to play with, is that if there was something that wasn't in their room and their sibling was playing with it, then they had to let the sibling finish playing with it before they moved it to their room and put it off limits.
Mm-hmm. That's
6-year-old up with that, and that's a 3-year-old telling us what the concerns were.
That's so awesome that was your example, because I use that example in one of my books of that we have like shared materials. All the toys are in the main living space, and we don't keep toys in the bedroom except if the kids have a toy that they're really focused on or working on or not, they don't want to share at the moment. That toy lives in their room until they're done with it, and then it comes back out into the main living space, which, just like in your example, was a solution that my kids came up with that totally came from them. So it really is moving through that same process that you do one-on-one, but just with the sibling group, right? So they each take turns understanding the experience of the other, like that would be like the empathy step, and they agree on the problem, and then they brainstorm solutions until they find a common ground, like a solution that they can both agree with.
Same deal.
Excellent.
Say that with siblings, and quite frankly, even sometimes with kids and adults, in the beginning, they aren't very good at talking to each other yet, and they aren't very good at listening yet. Mm-hmm. And so there are times when they need a little bit of practice at that before it sort of goes as well as it could. There are times when, as a therapist, I can't have them in the same room together, in which case I'll do what Henry Kissinger would have called shuttle diplomacy. I'm having one in there and hearing their concerns on the unsolved problem, then I'm having that one go out and hearing the other person's concerns on the unsolved problem. And then when we're ready to actually sign the treaty, we've got some ideas and we're getting together. That's when we put everybody together. So that happens sometimes, but that's actually fairly rare.
Right. It's when you start off the process of resolving the conflict, quote unquote, with that empathy step. I find that with my kids and with the families I work with, that goes a long way in everybody putting down their arms.
Right.
Yeah, like holding the space for everybody, for their experience and their feelings about something to actually be heard is really disarming.
We just have to see if we can get some of our politicians trained.
Oh my gosh, please. let's take our deep dive. The show notes can be found at sageparenting.com/podcast25, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So what are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic? And of course, we're going to have a link to the Explosive Child book and to that assessment form that you have on your website.
Well, the holy grail of resources on this model is the website of my nonprofit, Lives in the Balance, which is lives, Lives, in the balance.org. And I mean to tell you, it is an absolute treasure trove. There are walking tours that are filled with streaming video and audio programming. There's a listening library that literally has thousands of hours of podcasts that we've done and archived. There's all the paperwork that goes along with the model. There's the research that we've done on the model and other people as well. So of all the places people want to go, and it's all free, to get more resources on the model, Lives in the Balance website is the place to start.
Oh, that sounds like an incredible resource. And The Explosive Child, guys, is absolutely in my book canon. It is one of the top books of all time that I recommend. So it should be part of the parenting curriculum out there for everybody. So definitely grab the book, go check out the website, and then I'll put a link specifically to that form for when you're ready to work through the process on your own. So thank you, Dr. Greene, so much for coming on and sharing this conversation with me. I've been a big fan for a long time, so it's been such an honor.
Thanks very much. I'm glad you had me on.